Hello everyone, I'm Nicole Alexander and I'm the author of The Cedar Tree, and I'd like to thank Fraser Coast Libraries for having me to visit today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the outline of the novel The Cedar Tree, some of the history behind it, and then I believe there's some questions that have been sent in via the library's Facebook page, so I'm going to address those as well. So the Cedar Tree is set in County Tipperary in Ireland, the Richmond Valley, specifically the Big Scrub in northern New South Wales, and also the Strzelecki Desert on the edge of the South Australian, on the South Australian-New South Wales border. And the story begins in 1949 when Stella O'Ryan flees her home, a barren sheep property on the edge of the Strzelecki Desert. And she leaves behind the graves of her husband Joe and a baby daughter. Now she has very little money and limited options, so she accepts an offer from her brother-in-law Harry to go and stay at the O'Ryan cane farm in the Richmond Valley in northern New South Wales. Now while she's there, Stella hopes to get some answers to the questions that have plagued her during her marriage. However, she discovers that Harry is quite a difficult man. He refuses to discuss his dead younger brother, and he also forbids Stella from speaking to a neighbour on an adjoining property. Now, the disputes within the O'Ryan family began almost a century earlier, when Irish cousins Brandon, Maggie and Sean O'Ryan also fled their home, County Tipperary, but as wanted criminals. By the 1860s, Brandon and Sean are working as cedar cutters in the Big Scrub in the Richmond Valley. But while Brandon is really keen to embrace the opportunities that this new life can offer him, Sean can't let go of the past. And it's the choices that these two cousins make during their lifetime that affect their relationship, but also their descendants into the next century. And particularly Stella, who marries into the O'Ryan family during the Second World War. So the Cedar Tree touches on Irish and Italian immigration, the age of the cedar cutters, the opening up of New South Wales following the introduction of the 1861 Robertson's Land Act, and the Second World War. So first of all, to just talk briefly on the 1860s section, some of the research, or history I should say, behind that to start off with. So it was quite a volatile time in New South Wales's history. So following the Great Famine, we have a lot of Irish immigrants coming into Australia, specifically New South Wales, eager to start a new life. But a lot of them brought with them quite negative sentiments towards the Protestant English. And that was because during the Great Famine, food exports, firstly, from Ireland to the UK were not halted at the request of the British government. Now this led to an increase in food prices in Ireland, which in turn put food out of reach for many, particularly the poor, but it also exacerbated the potato blight, which decimated a lot of crops, but particularly in the poorer counties of Ireland in the west and the south. Now, coupled with this were some fairly draconian laws imposed by the British during this period, which included forcing poor tenant farmers to pay a tithe to the English church. Now, if you were a Catholic farmer struggling to put food on the table for your family, you can imagine the animosities that grew when you were forced to pay a tithe to the English Protestant church. So that then brings us into a political snapshot of the period. So the Fenian Brotherhood and the Irish Republican Brotherhood were organisations dedicated to the establishment of an independent Irish Republic in the 19th and early 20th centuries. There was a Fenian movement in Australia during this period, and in the Cedar Tree we see Sean becoming a part of that movement. Now there was a lot of anti-Irish sentiment during this period as well. They were seen by many as being untrustworthy, uneducated and uncouth. And this anti-Irish sentiment increased with the threat of Fenian terrorism. Now these sort of Fenian rumblings are played out alongside the introduction of the 1861 Robertson's Land Act, which was when the Governor of New South Wales basically started to unlock the land that squatters had had such a hold on and open it up for selection and sale, and I'll talk about that a little later. But a part of the 1860 section is also set in the Big Scrub in the Richmond Valley. Now, the Big Scrub was once Australia's largest lowland subtropical rainforest, and it was located between Byron Bay, Ballina and Lismore. And prior to European settlement, it covered around 75,000 hectares. By 1900, only 1% of that pristine rainforest remained. Now, this was because the Big Scrub was filled with quality timbers, and none was more valuable than the red cedar tree, which was highly prized by the Royal Navy, furniture and ship makers, as well as house builders. And the cedar cutters were really savvy men. They were rough men, but they were savvy men. They would actually follow the newspaper reports of the day and see where the most recent surveyors and explorers had been. And if it was to areas that were similar to where previous stands of cedar had been found, they would rush to those regions, eager to fulfill the demand for this highly prized timber. So the cedar cutters and the cedar industry is really credited with stimulating Australia's economy during that period. And the cedar cutters themselves are credited with the establishment of numerous inland towns and villages with a really strong shipbuilding industry, and of course a strong shipping industry as well, because we had to get those valuable logs further afield to markets such as Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide. But at the same time, even though the cedar industry was so important to Australia's growth as a colony and an economy, and the cedar cutters were seen as pioneers in many areas, it did of course lead to the decimation of a beautiful rainforest. So now to talk a little bit, and I know this is actually one of the questions that was sent through to Fraser Coast Libraries for me to answer on the inspiration for the novel. So I'm just going to pop it in here a little bit earlier because it sort of fits in line with what I'm talking about. But when I started researching the Cedar Tree, I'd already decided to set half of it in the 1860s in the Richmond Valley. During this period, I actually received a letter from one of my aunts, and in it was a copy of my paternal great-grandfather's obituary. And the notice mentioned that he'd been one of the first settlers to take up land along the Murray River in southern New South Wales following introduction of the 1861 Robertson's Land Act. Now, I was already aware of that, but having begun researching the Cedar Tree, it got me thinking a lot more deeply about what was happening in New South Wales at the time and the land disputes as well. So that Land Act came into being when the Governor of the day bowed to pressure from would-be selectors to end the monopoly that squatters held over vast tracts of grazing land in New South Wales. So following the Act's introduction over a period of years, more and more settlers started coming into New South Wales, and all of them, of course, were eager to stake a claim for land. But in a lot of cases, that land had been previously owned by these huge squatters, landowning squatters. So the squatters took the view that the Governor was stealing the land via the Act, land that only they had had the tenacity, basically, to settle and manage and make a go of for the previous decades. The would-be selectors, on the other hand, had the law behind them. So that's when we see land disputes breaking out between the pastoralists and between not only honest settlers, but also would-be land speculators. So dummy agreements were used to draw up title deeds. Tactics were used as well, where people would actually go in and pick the eye teeth out of available land and making sure they had access to good water. We know how important water is in Australia, but particularly rural Australia for our businesses out here. And they also had another problem as well, is that when they were picking the eye teeth out of the land, it also meant that other blocks became less valuable. So while the Land Act was actually introduced to, end this, squatting on large areas of grazing properties, when people came in and started doing these dummy titles to claim land, they were buying up extra land that was considered to be less valuable because maybe the water prospects weren't as great. So we still had this accumulation of land. And we had another problem added to that as well, in that the Lands Department was really behind in checking their records. So it took them quite a number of years to work out which land title claims were actually kosher and which ones were totally illegal. So that's some of the inspiration behind the story, behind the Cedar Tree. So now I'm just going to touch on the 1940s section of the novel, and where we have one of our main characters, Stella, marrying into the Orion family. So when I first started researching this section of the novel, I was actually reading very widely on Italians and Italian immigration into Australia, particularly between the 1920s and the 1960s, because that's when we see a large increase in Italian immigration coming into this country, and particularly following the end of the Second World War. And the greater majority of Italians coming into Australia during that period were men. Now, the interesting thing about this immigration was that the Italians didn't assimilate very well into Australian society, particularly around about the 1940s. And there are two reasons for this. One, in 1940, Italy declared war against Great Britain and her allies. So immediately there was a lot of suspicions towards Italians in this country, which led to some of them seeing out the Second World War in internment camps. But the other reason is a lot more basic, and it was simply because Italians didn't really like our culture. They didn't like the way we lived, and they were desperate to retain a strong Italian culture. And crucial to that was marrying an Italian woman rather than taking an Australian as your wife. So that's when we see these strict courting protocols coming into play in Australia as part of arranged marriages. So when I started researching Stella's character for the Cedar Tree, I decided that I wanted her to be the granddaughter of poor Italian immigrants. A young woman who's, emotionally lost when we first meet her, a little distant. She's single, early 30s, the Second World War has broken out. She wants to marry for love, but she is very aware of her Italian heritage. When her parents actually try and arrange for her to meet a man with a view to marriage, she decides not to go along with it. She walks away from it, and in doing so she cuts herself off from her family. And then when she meets Joe Orion and marries him, and they move to the Strzelecki Desert to a sheep property, she cuts herself further, again, not only off from civilization to a certain extent, but also from her own life, and to a certain extent the hopes and dreams that she had as a young woman before she married as well. So the actual location of the Strzelecki Desert becomes extremely critical to Stella's development as far as her character is concerned during the course of the narrative. And now I'm going to answer some of the questions that have been sent through, so you have to bear with me to put my glasses on. So the first question was, what was your inspiration for the Cedar Tree plot? So I think I probably touched on that already. So it was learning and reading a little bit more about what was happening following the introduction of the 1861 Robertson's Land Act. And I was also quite keen to explore the sort of Catholic versus Protestant angst that was occurring in this country in the 1800s, and also continued on into the early 1900s as well. My research for the story always involves for all of my books, a lot of general reading on the subject and the era I'm going to be writing about. And from there I then hone down onto specific issues as I'm writing. Otherwise I could keep researching and reading, and I'd probably become lost in my own sleuthing instead of concentrating on getting words down on the page. I do field trips. I find that they are really important as far as lending authenticity to my work. I am writing historical fiction, but to get and particularly as I'm writing, most of my stories are set in Australia, to get a really good handle on values and ideals and regions and landscapes, etc. It's quite essential for me to go out and actually see and feel the place I'm going to be writing about. So I had a week in the Richmond Valley looking at some of the cane properties out there, because that also forms a part of the story. I went to a number of libraries and also historical societies as well. Historical societies are wonderful because the members are very passionate about their areas and they share some really fabulous stories. Stories, I think, that are passed on to you when you're researching really adds that element of realism to a work, because you get a great feel for what a place is like from the stories that have been passed down. For example, when I was at the Lismore Historical Society, I was actually told stories from a member there about the angst between the Protestants and Catholics in the 1860s. Apparently in Lismore they used to walk on the opposite sides of the street from each other. They would pelt rotten eggs at each other. In the 1880s, riots actually broke out between Catholics and Protestants. So there was a lot of angst there, and a lot of it stemmed from what had happened during and following the Great Famine in Ireland. So that was the first section of my research. The second section of my research had me travelling to the Strzelecki Desert on the New South Wales South Australian border. Now, I really had to go out there so I could get a great feel of what it would have been like to be Stella, a young woman, city-born, Italian in origin, ethnicity, going against her parents' wishes, young bride going to a remote station. So I had pastoral lease maps and I searched through exactly where I wanted the fictional Kuruma station to be located in Western New South Wales. And I decided that I wanted Stella to be based quite close to the New South Wales South Australian border, across the border from Lake Frome, which is a large shallow salt pan near the Dingo Fence. So I literally wanted her to be able to taste salt on her tongue when a westerly blew. So I went through these pastoral lease maps. I pinpointed the area where I wanted Stella to be located for that section of the novel. And then I started cold calling people on properties in that area, asking if I could just simply travel out there and get a feel for the land. A day trip, basically. I actually ended up being referred to a property in the exact location where I wanted my fictional Kuruma station to be located. They were keen readers. They had read my works. So they invited me to stay, which was absolutely wonderful. So I spent nearly a week out there. So in the evenings, I was reading through their archives. They were, in fact, a sheep property in the 1940s. So that was fascinating, understanding what was happening in that region, specifically during the period of the Second World War, because Western New South Wales, those remote areas, labour is often scarce anyway, but during the Second World War, even more so. And in some cases, the only reason a lot of wool clips got to market during this period was because the government of the time ensured that there were shearing teams going around, doing a circuit, if you like, making sure that clips got to market. This was because, just as we had done during the First World War, we were actually under contract to Britain to supply wool for uniforms. So, reading during the night, during the day I had my backpack on and I was traipsing through the Strzelecki Desert. It's quite an extraordinary environment. It's made up of gibber plains, quartz rock deposits and these rolling dunes, and of course the further west you go, the larger these dunes become and the more stunted the vegetation. The Strzelecki dunes are part of the continental dune fields that originate in central Australia, and then of course they come gradually eastwards, extending into New South Wales, into the area that we know as corner country. You know, when I was going out into the desert, I had my backpack with snacks, water, sunscreen, writing material, what else did I have? My compass, because once you get out in the dunes, it really does, every direction looks exactly the same. So I was very much reminded of the difficulties that our early explorers would have faced going through those really desolate, harsh areas. You know, for thousands of years, Indigenous Australians have been living in those arid environments, and they actually relied on the shallow seepage wells between dunes to access water. Now, while I was out there, I dug and dug on numerous occasions trying to find water, even though I was carrying some with me. Clearly, you need to know exactly what you're doing. And I would imagine that Sturt had a similar problem in 1844 when he travelled through that area in search of the great inland sea, which of course, as we know, doesn't exist. He camped at Floods Creek, which actually runs through the property that I was staying on. And it's a wonderfully named creek, actually, because it only floods once every 20 years, but still. But I could just imagine him in 1844, you know, looking at those dunes and just wondering which direction he should actually be going in. So that's a little bit of my research. As far as the stories, as you can imagine, the stories that I was told in the Richmond Valley of northern New South Wales were very different to the ones I heard in the Strzelecki Desert. For example, the dingo fence runs down the New South Wales South Australian border, as many of you would know, and around the turn of the century there was a boundary rider who was in charge of maintenance for a section of the fence, and he was based at Cameron's Corner. Apparently he was quite a sturdy chap, because he did his runs on horseback wearing only a hat and his riding boots, although occasionally in winter when it was a bit cool he was known to put a shirt on. There's another story that I was told about a woman on an outlying property somewhere between the 1930s and the 1940s, in era we're talking about. And she and her husband, they did live in a very remote area, and they basically lived on mutton and potatoes and cabbage every night of the week. So she complained on numerous occasions to her husband that she was absolutely sick and tired of what they were eating for meals every night, and he ignored her. So it was too much for her. She went down to the woolshed one day and found a bottle of arsenic. And from that moment on, every evening she added a very small amount to his meal. Now, after a year, apparently he was still going strong with showing absolutely no signs of being any worse for the wear. So she gave him one final good dose and he died the next day. Now, apparently when a doctor went out to the property to check him and check on the cause of death, he realised straight away that he'd been poisoned. And the word was that he said to her, if you just held out a little longer, you probably would have got away with it. Because, of course, in that day and age, we didn't have all the great, medical testing that we have today. Okay, so I'm just going to have another look at these questions. So if you could give just one piece of advice to aspiring authors, what would it be? I'm actually going to give two pieces. One, read a lot and read widely. If you only read, say, crime, read fantasy, read historical fiction, read contemporary novels, read anything you can get your hands on. Look how other people construct stories, how they develop characters, what narrative voice they choose to use for telling their story. And the other thing is draft, redraft, rewrite. Unfortunately, writing is all about putting one's backside in the chair and going over sentences and paragraphs again and again and again. The idea really is, and I have said this on a few occasions, but writing is really about refining and making that manuscript shine like a pearl. And the last question here is, what have I been reading during lockdown? Well, actually, I've been reading having a bit of an Irish moment. So the first one I read a few weeks ago now is Anne Enright's Actress. And it tells the story, I've forgotten the main character's name now, Catherine O'Dell, and of course it's totally fictional, and her life as an actor, but it's told through her daughter's eyes. And it's quite a fascinating account of an Irish actress and her trip to Hollywood and back again, and her inevitable breakdown, I suppose, at the end of her acting life. But it's actually quite a fascinating story, and Anne Wright is a very, very fine writer. So that one's worthwhile reading. This other one is by Sebastian Barry. Sebastian Barry is the current Irish laureate for Irish fiction, and he's a brilliant writer, absolutely brilliant writer. This story is about a young Lakota orphan who's actually adopted by two gay soldiers, if I can use that word in this politically correct world we're living in now, following the American Civil War. And they're now, in this story now, they're based on a tobacco farm in Tennessee. The voice he uses is quite extraordinary. The story is interesting, but it's just the way it's written that really grabbed me, and I do really admire his work. I read a number of his books, and of course he's a big prize winner as well. And the other one I've just started reading is The River by Chris Hammer, who you probably recognise the name. He's an Australian journo who then started writing fiction as well. And this is quite an interesting story of a journey down through the Murray-Darling River. I mean, Murray-Darling River is really our equivalent of the Nile in Australia, and I think it's the type of book that's probably well worth reading. The other book I'm reading is one that's also set on the Darling River. May give you a little bit of a hint to what I might be writing about in my next novel. And it was actually written by C.W. Bean, our great war historian, who did that, numerous numbers of volumes on the First World War, and he instigated the building of the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. And I think that was called Journey Down the Degnor. I didn't bring it with me because I thought 3 was enough. So that's it. So I have to say thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much to Fraser Coast Libraries and to Lou Collins for having me to visit. And I hope that this cold weather goes away because it's freezing here today. Thank you.